Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck, joined as always by my partner in historical crime, Marco.
Though unlike today's subject, I've never buried anyone alive.
Oh, we're starting strong. Yeah, buckle up, listeners. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and brutal figures in early medieval history, Olga of Kiev.
Also known as Saint Olga, which, after you hear what she did, you may question how sainthood gets handed out.
Exactly. Olga is remembered as both a Christian saint and a ruthless avenger. She lived in the 10th century and became regent of the Kievan Rus after her husband, Prince Igor, was assassinated.
And when we say assassinated, we mean in a very medieval, very messy way.
So before we get into Olga's legendary revenge tour, let's set the stage. We're talking about the 10th century, the early days of the Kievan Rus, which was basically a loose federation of Slavic tribes ruled by a Scandinavian, or Varangian, elite. Think Vikings who decided to settle down inland instead of raiding coastal towns.
Right, these guys were traders, warriors, and tax collectors, all rolled into one. Kiev, where Olga and Igor ruled, was the beating heart of this confederation. Sitting on the Dnieper River, it was perfectly placed for trade between the Baltic Sea and the Byzantine Empire.
Exactly. And Byzantine trade meant wealth. But that wealth depended on collecting tribute, basically taxes, from the tribes under Rus control. This is where Olga's husband, Prince Igor, comes in.
Igor had a problem. He wasn't very good at this ruling thing. The Primary Chronicle, our main source for this period, paints him as greedy and not particularly smart.
Yeah, he didn't inherit the charisma of his predecessor, Oleg, who had expanded the Rus with both cunning and force. Igor, instead, was more clumsy.
Which brings us to the Drevlians. They were one of the Slavic tribes paying tribute to Kiev. The relationship was tense, sometimes they paid up, sometimes they resisted.
And in 945, Igor made a fatal mistake. He collected his tribute from the Drevlians, started marching home, and then thought, you know what? I bet I can squeeze them for just a little more.
Worst idea ever.
When he went back to demand double tribute, the Drevlians snapped. They captured Igor and executed him in a way so gruesome it's become legend. Some accounts say they bent 2 trees down, tied Igor's legs to them, and then let the trees snap upright, tearing him in half.
Which sounds not fun. That's a bad day at work.
And suddenly, Kiev had a leadership crisis. Igor was dead, his son Sviatoslav was just a kid, like 3 years old, and that left Olga as regent.
Now, in most cases, a widowed queen in the 10th century might try to survive by remarrying, maybe align herself with another strong ruler.
But Olga wasn't most widows. Instead of quietly managing the throne until her son grew up, she became one of the most formidable rulers in Eastern European history.
And spoiler alert, if you thought the Drevlians got away with killing Igor, you're about to learn how wrong you are.
So Olga was suddenly the ruler of Kiev, a widow with a young son, and a dangerous tribe, the Drevlians, had just murdered her husband.
And here's the thing, the Drevlians didn't think of this as open rebellion. They thought they were being practical. They'd gotten rid of Igor, so they figured, why not make a new alliance?
Yeah, in their minds, the logical solution was, hey Olga, why don't you marry our prince, Mal, and then we'll be one big happy family.
Which is hilarious, because that's like murdering your neighbor and then asking their spouse to move in.
Exactly. But Olga didn't just say no. She decided to make an example of them, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. Remember, the Kievan Rus was this patchwork of tribes. If she looked weak, other groups might rise up too.
So her revenge wasn't random cruelty, it was a political message, cross me, and you'll regret it.
Let's break down her 4 acts of vengeance, because they're so theatrical they read almost like folklore.
Act 1, The Ambassadors. The Drevlians sent 20 men to Kiev with a marriage proposal. Olga welcomed them, told them to wait in their boat while her people carried it through the streets as a sign of honor.
Except the honor ended when the boat was dropped into a massive trench and the ambassadors were buried alive.
Brutal, but also symbolic. In Slavic culture, burial rites were sacred. To bury someone alive wasn't just execution, it was dishonor.
Act 2, Round 2 of Ambassadors. The Drevlians, totally clueless, sent more envoys. Olga pretended to receive them kindly, told them to rest in the bathhouse after their long journey. And then, she locked the doors and burned the building down.
Fire purification, another symbolic choice. Fire was sacred in pagan tradition. By burning them, Olga was essentially declaring that the gods themselves rejected the Drevlians' proposal.
Act 3, the funeral feast. Olga told the Drevlians she was ready to honor her late husband with a proper ceremony in their capital, Iskorostan. They agreed, probably thinking peace was finally at hand.
Except when the feast began and everyone got drunk, Olga gave the signal. Her men massacred about 5,000 Drevlians on the spot.
This is important. Funeral feasts were communal bonding events in Slavic culture. By turning it into a slaughter, she desecrated what was supposed to be sacred hospitality. It sent the message, "You killed my husband? Now I'll make sure you can't even mourn properly."
And finally, Act 4, the most legendary. Olga laid siege to Iskorostan, but the city held strong. So she offered a deal: "I don't need more tribute. Just give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household."
Sounds harmless, right? The Drevlians were probably thinking, "Wow, what a merciful ruler."
But no. Olga had her soldiers tie sulfur and burning cloth to the birds. When they were released, the birds flew home to their nests under the city's thatched roofs.
Within hours, the entire city was on fire. People fled, only to be captured by Olga's forces. Some were killed, some enslaved, and others forced to pay heavy tribute.
And there it was, for perfectly orchestrated acts of revenge that not only destroyed the Drevlians but also cemented Olga's reputation as a ruler you absolutely did not mess with.
Notice how every act wasn't just violent, it carried symbolic weight. Burial, fire, feasting, birds, these weren't random choices. Olga understood the cultural language of her time and used it as psychological warfare.
Which is why the Drevlians are remembered in history books mainly as the people who messed with Olga, and paid for it in the most spectacular ways possible.
So, after the Drevlians were crushed, Olga had secured her throne and proven she wasn't to be trifled with. But here's where her story takes a really surprising turn.
Yeah, because this same woman who buried men alive and firebombed a city with pigeons eventually becomes the first Christian ruler of the Kievan Rus.
It's one of history's great plot twists. Around the year 957, Olga traveled to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire. And this was no small trip. It meant she was stepping onto the world stage, dealing directly with one of the most powerful empires of the time.
Right, Constantinople was basically New York, Paris, and Rome rolled into one, rich, cultured, and intimidating. And Olga wasn't there just to sightsee.
She was baptized into Christianity, taking the name Helena, likely after the empress. Some accounts say the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII himself sponsored her baptism.
Which, if true, is wild. Imagine the emperor personally acting as your godfather. That wasn't just a religious act, it was a political alliance.
Exactly. By accepting Christianity, Olga was strengthening ties with Byzantium and putting herself on equal footing with Christian rulers across Europe.
But here's the tricky part: when she got back to Kiev, she tried to bring her people along with her. Her son, Sviatoslav, was still young but already leaning into the old pagan warrior culture. He refused to convert, saying his men would laugh at him if he gave up their gods.
Which shows that Olga was ahead of her time. She understood that Christianity was more than just faith, it was a diplomatic tool, a way to align her kingdom with the most powerful empire in the region.
It also gave her personal prestige. Pagan rulers could be feared, sure, but Christian rulers had legitimacy in the eyes of other monarchs. By being baptized, Olga was playing a long game.
And she wasn't wrong. Even though she couldn't convert her son, her grandson Vladimir the Great eventually did, and in 988 he made Christianity the official religion of the Kievan Rus. That decision transformed Eastern Europe for centuries to come.
Which means Olga planted the seed. Without her, Vladimir's later mass conversion might not have been possible.
That's why the Orthodox Church gave her the title equal to the apostles. She's celebrated not just as a saint, but as someone who brought her people closer to the Christian world, even if it took another generation to fully bloom.
And that's the contradiction that makes her so fascinating. She's remembered both for her ruthless vengeance and for her holy conversion.
from fire and blood to faith and baptism. Olga of Kiev lived both extremes. So we've seen both sides of Olga, the ruthless avenger who annihilated the Drevlians, and the devout Christian who laid the groundwork for the Christianization of Rus. The question is, how do we make sense of that?
Well, her legacy splits in a couple of different directions. First, in the religious tradition, Olga is remembered as a saint. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, she's given the title equal to the apostles. That's the same honorific given to major figures like Mary Magdalene and Constantine the Great.
And that's not just a token title, it reflects the idea that she fundamentally changed the trajectory of her people's spiritual life. Without Olga's example, it's unlikely her grandson Vladimir would have made Christianity the state religion.
But in the political and historical record, she's remembered as one of the most effective rulers of Kievan Rus. At a time when women rarely held power in Europe, Olga managed to rule independently, defend her throne, and keep her realm intact during a dangerous regency.
That's huge. Most regents were placeholders. Olga wasn't just keeping the seat warm for her son, she was consolidating power and making sure the Rus were feared by their enemies.
And let's not forget her style of leadership. Her revenge wasn't just bloody, it was performative. Burying people alive, burning them in a bathhouse, firebombing a city with birds, these weren't just punishments. They were meant to terrify and resonate culturally.
Which is why Olga shows up not just in chronicles, but in folklore and legend. She became larger than life, almost mythological.
Fast forward to today, and you see her legacy pop up in surprising places. In Russia and Ukraine, she's still honored as a foundational figure. Statues of her stand in Kiev and Pskov. And in modern Orthodox calendars, she has her own feast day, July 11th.
She's even seeped into popular culture. Historians and writers love her as an example of a woman who shattered expectations. And honestly, her story feels like it belongs in a Netflix series. Palace intrigue, revenge, fire, religion, it's all there.
Yeah, she's like a mix of Cersei Lannister and Joan of Arc, ruthless strategist and saintly visionary rolled into one.
And that duality is what makes her unforgettable. Olga of Kiev is remembered both as the woman who burned cities to ash and as the saint who brought light to her people.
Which, if nothing else, proves that history doesn't always fit neatly into categories. You can be both feared and revered, brutal and holy, all in the same lifetime.
Olga embodied the contradictions of her age, and that's why, over 1,000 years later, we're still talking about her. And that brings us to the end of today's episode on Olga of Kiev, the widow who outsmarted her enemies, avenged her husband in spectacular fashion, and then turned toward faith to reshape the destiny of her people.
She's one of those figures who just doesn't fit in a box. Was she a saint? Absolutely. Was she a ruthless warlord? Also yes.
And that's why she's so compelling. Olga shows us that history is full of contradictions. People can be both violent and visionary, terrifying and transformative.
And in her case, that contradiction literally set the course for Eastern Europe's religious and political future. Without Olga, her grandson Vladimir might never have converted the Rus, and that changes everything about Russian, Ukrainian, and even European history.
Which is why she's still remembered today, not just in churches and statues, but in the imagination of anyone who loves a story about power, faith, and fire.
All right, before we wrap up, just a quick reminder, our episodes are evergreen, so whether you found this show the day it dropped or 2 years later, the story of Olga is still just as wild.
And if you enjoyed today's historical dive, please take a moment to give us a 5-star review. It really does help this podcast grow and lets more people discover the stories we love telling.
Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and share this one with a friend, especially the friend you trust to help you set a city on fire with pigeons.
You know who you are.
You can also hit us up on social media to suggest future topics. We love hearing from you.
And check out our new merch, linked in the show notes. History looks even better on a hoodie.
Thanks for hanging out with us today, and as always,
stay curious.
Rus was struck down, and his widow bore the pain. The Drevlians thought her broken, a widow to command, but Olga of Kiev had vengeance in her hand. Olga's fire, burning higher through the night, her name resounds, not with mercy, not with pity, but with justice, fierce and bound. They came with false proposals, be our queen, take our king. But she buried them in trenches, lit the night with suffering. 3 times they thought to bind her, 3 times they met their fate. For Olga's wrath was patient, and her justice would not wait. Olga's fire, burning higher through the night, her name resounds, not with mercy, not with pity, but with justice, fierce and bound. From embers in the rafters to flames that kiss the sky, she set the towns ablaze and heard the Drevlians cry. Not with sword or spearhead, but cutting cold and clear, Olga forged an empire that the world would learn to fear. Yet baptism found her later, a saint the church would call. But tales of fire and fury linger louder than them all. A mother to a nation, a ruler carved in stone, the first to